Clara sat in the dimly lit living room, staring at the TV screen that played the same show she'd already watched a dozen times. Ethan, her husband of 2 years, had been distant for weeks now. The once loving and attentive partner she'd married seemed to vanish, replaced by a man who buried himself in work and hardly ever looked her way. It wasn't just the long hours he worked, it was the emotional distance that began to grow between them. She felt invisible, unnoticed, and worse, unimportant. She tried to talk to him about it, to express how she felt, but every time she did, he dismissed her concerns with an offhand comment or a vague promise to work on it. It wasn't enough. She didn't need promises anymore, she needed him to see her. But instead, she felt like a ghost in her own home, a shadow of the woman she used to be. That night, as dinner simmered on the stove, Clara set the table, trying to force the tension out of her mind. She had spent hours planning this dinner, hoping it might remind Ethan of the early days in their marriage when they'd share meals, laugh, and talk late into the night. She lit a few candles, put on her favorite playlist, and tried to be the version of herself she used to be. The woman who wasn't afraid to be vulnerable. Ethan came through the door, his tired eyes not even looking up to greet her. He hung his coat up in silence and walked past her, heading straight for the couch. The weight of his indifference hit her like a slap to the face. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat, forcing herself to breathe evenly. "Ethan, can we talk?" she asked quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. She didn't want to sound desperate, but she couldn't hold back the frustration any longer. He glanced up at her briefly, just enough to give a nonchalant shrug. "Not now, Clara. I'm tired. Can we do this later?" Clara felt the anger flare up inside her, a sharp, burning feeling that rose from her chest to her throat. She had been patient, she had tried so hard to give him the space he needed, but this felt like the last straw. She didn't want him to be tired anymore. She didn't want him to brush her off as though she didn't matter. "I don't want to wait," she snapped, her voice trembling slightly but strong enough to make Ethan sit up and finally face her. "I need to talk to you now. Why are you always so distant? Why do you always push me away like I don't matter?" Ethan's face hardened, his usual defense mechanism taking over. He ran a hand through his hair and sighed, clearly frustrated with the conversation already. "Clara, this isn't about you. I've just got a lot on my plate at work. I don't need this right now. Can you not see that I'm doing this for us?" Clara felt a knot form in her stomach. The same excuse, over and over again. She didn't care about the work. She cared about the man she had married, the man who used to be her best friend. He wasn't there anymore. "No, Ethan. This isn't about work," she said, her voice breaking. "This is about us, and you don't seem to care anymore. I'm not asking for much. I'm just asking for you to look at me. To see me." Her hands trembled, and she could feel her chest tighten as she spoke. "I feel like I'm losing you, and I don't know what to do." Ethan stood up abruptly, his face hardening with irritation. "I don't have time for this drama, Clara. I'm doing everything I can to keep us afloat, and all you do is nag me about things I can't change right now. It's exhausting." His words cut through her like a knife. She had expected him to be upset, but she hadn't expected him to turn everything around on her, to make it sound like her emotions were a burden. She wanted to scream, to lash out, to make him understand how deeply hurt she felt, but the words she needed to say wouldn't come. Instead, in a moment of overwhelming frustration and helplessness, Clara did something she had never thought she would do. She slapped him across the face. The sound of her hand against his cheek echoed in the silence of the room, and the sharp sting in her palm was nothing compared to the shock in his eyes. Ethan stumbled back slightly, his hand going to his cheek, as if trying to process what had just happened. Clara's heart raced, her breath shallow, as she stared at him in disbelief, realizing what she had just done. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, his face a mixture of shock and anger. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Clara, her hands still trembling, could barely breathe as the realization hit her. She had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. The slap echoed through the room, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Clara stood there, her hands still raised, her chest heaving with ragged breaths. Her mind was racing, trying to process what she had just done. She couldn't take it back. The weight of her anger, of all the months of feeling invisible and neglected, had built up to this moment. But now, as the shock settled in, she wished she could undo it. Ethan didn't move for what felt like an eternity. His hand was pressed to his cheek, eyes wide with disbelief. The tension between them was suffocating, the air thick with the aftermath of her outburst. Clara felt her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with the realization that she had just shattered something irreparable. He slowly lowered his hand, and when he finally looked at her, his face was unreadable. The anger in his eyes wasn't what Clara expected, it was something deeper, something that cut through her more than any harsh words ever could. "What the hell, Clara?" Ethan's voice was low, strained, almost trembling with shock. His usual calm demeanor had crumbled completely. "How could you do that?" Clara opened her mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat tightened, and the lump in her chest grew heavier. She had never intended to hurt him, but now the guilt was eating her alive. She had wanted to make him feel something, anything, to wake him up to the distance that had formed between them, but this wasn't what she'd imagined. This wasn't supposed to be the way she showed her pain. I'm sorry," she whispered, the words feeling hollow as they left her lips. "I don't know what I was thinking. But Ethan cut her off, his voice breaking, a mix of anger and hurt. "Sorry. That's all you have to say. You hit me, Clara. You actually hit me." Clara's knees felt weak, and she took a step back, her hands shaking at her sides. She wanted to reach out to him, to hold him, but she knew she couldn't. He wouldn't let her. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone with an apology. Ethan took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled motions. But the tension in his eyes was palpable. He was no longer the man she had married, the one who would comfort her when she cried, the one who used to understand her better than anyone. Now, he looked at her as if he didn't know who she was anymore. "I need some space," he said, his voice cold, distant. "I can't do this. I don't know if I can stay here after what you just did." Clara's heart sank into her stomach. She knew that Ethan had been pulling away for a while, but she had never imagined it would lead to this. She had thought that if she expressed how she felt, if she showed him just how desperate she was, things would get better. But instead, she had pushed him away even further. "I didn't mean it, Ethan. Please, don't leave," she begged, her voice breaking. Tears started to fall, unbidden, as she reached for him, but he stepped back, shaking his head. "No," he said, his voice firm. "I need some time away from you. I can't just pretend like nothing happened." Clara felt like the ground was slipping out from under her. She had never felt more alone than in that moment. The man she loved, the man she thought she knew, was walking away from her, and it was because of something she had done. She had ruined everything. Ethan grabbed his coat from the back of the chair and moved toward the door. Clara stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to stop him, to beg him not to leave, but she knew that was the last thing he needed from her. She had already begged for his attention, and it had led to this. "I'll be back later to grab some things," Ethan said, his voice softening slightly. But there was no warmth in it, no love. It was just a statement of fact, as if he were telling her that he was simply going to the store. And with that, he left. The door clicked shut behind him, and Clara was left standing alone in the silence. The weight of her actions crashed down on her, suffocating her, and she sank to the floor, her hands covering her face as sobs racked her body. She didn't know how long she sat there, crying, lost in her guilt and despair. She had never imagined that a moment of anger, a single slap, could destroy everything she had worked so hard to build. But now she was left with nothing but the overwhelming knowledge that she had pushed him away, and it might be too late to fix it. Clara spent the next few days in a haze of confusion and regret. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan's shocked face, the hurt in his eyes, the way he had stepped away from her as though she were a stranger. She couldn't escape the thought that she had ruined everything. The guilt weighed heavily on her chest, tightening with each passing hour. She had tried calling him, but her attempts were met with silence. Ethan wasn't answering her calls or texts. She knew he needed space, but the uncertainty of not knowing if he would ever come back was gnawing at her. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart skipped a beat, only to fall with disappointment when it wasn't him. Clara's parents had always been there for her, even when things went wrong. They had offered her their support, their comfort, and this time was no different. After a few days of barely eating or sleeping, she finally called her mother, her voice cracking as she spoke. "Mom, I don't know what to do. I think I've ruined everything with Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother's voice was calm but filled with concern. "Sweetheart, come home. You don't need to go through this alone." It was a comfort, but it also felt like a failure. Clara had always prided herself on being independent, on handling her problems without burdening others. But this time, it was different. This time, she couldn't handle the weight of the consequences alone. Packing a small bag, Clara left their apartment, the place where she and Ethan had once made so many happy memories. The space that had once felt like home now felt empty, cold, like a foreign place. As she locked the door behind her for what felt like the last time, the finality of it hit her. She wasn't just leaving the apartment. She was leaving the life she had built with Ethan. Her parents' house was quiet when she arrived, and the familiar scent of her mother's cooking and the soft hum of the TV were the only sounds that greeted her. Her mother wrapped her arms around her, holding her tightly, as if trying to absorb the hurt and confusion that Clara couldn't express. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't know what I was thinking," Clara whispered, tears welling up once more. "You made a mistake, sweetheart," her mother said, gently guiding her to the couch. "But mistakes don't define who you are. What matters now is how you move forward." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes, but the words didn't comfort her. Moving forward felt impossible. She had shattered her marriage, and now she was living in her childhood home, a place that once felt safe but now felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. Days turned into weeks, and Clara tried to adjust to her new reality. She woke up every morning with the same feeling of emptiness, a constant ache in her heart. She tried to keep busy, helping her parents around the house, but it never felt enough. The silence of her life without Ethan was deafening. Everywhere she went, she was reminded of the life she had chosen to leave behind. The ring on her finger, the pictures they had taken together, the plans they had made, all of it haunted her. She had hoped that with time, the pain would dull, but it only seemed to grow stronger. She began to question herself more than ever. Was she too quick to act on her anger? Was there any way to repair the damage? The thought of Ethan moving on, of him never coming back, was unbearable, but the more she thought about it, the more it seemed like the only reality she might have to face. Clara had no idea how to fix this. She didn't know if there was even a chance for reconciliation. But one thing was certain, she couldn't keep living in this limbo. Something had to change, and the only person who could make that change was her. It had been a month since Clara moved back in with her parents, and the days had started to blur together. The constant ache in her chest, the heaviness of her regret, never seemed to fade. She'd lost count of how many times she replayed the moment in her mind, the slap, Ethan's eyes widening with disbelief, the finality of his departure. Each time, the guilt cut deeper. Despite the overwhelming sadness, she tried to maintain a semblance of routine. She helped her mother with chores, spent time with her father, and occasionally went for walks in the park. Yet, none of it felt real. None of it felt like the life she was meant to be living. One evening, as Clara sat alone in her room, scrolling aimlessly on her phone, she felt a vibration in her pocket. Her heart skipped a beat. She looked at the screen, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Ethan. Her hands trembled as she answered, unsure of what to say. The sound of his voice on the other end was like a lifeline, pulling her back from the abyss she had been sinking into. Clara, his voice was soft, almost hesitant. I've been thinking a lot about everything. About what happened. Clara's throat tightened, and she held the phone to her ear, waiting for him to continue. Every part of her wanted to beg him to come back, to tell him how sorry she was, but she didn't know where to start. I didn't expect to hear from you, Clara said quietly, her voice shaky. I thought you didn't want to talk to me. Ethan sighed on the other end, and there was a long pause before he spoke again. I didn't know what to say either. I was angry, and I needed time to think. But it's been too long, Clara. I can't keep running from this. Clara closed her eyes, letting the weight of his words sink in. She wanted to believe that this was the moment things would change, that they could somehow fix what had been broken. But she also feared that this call might be a final attempt at closure, not reconciliation. I've been staying with my parents, Clara said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. I don't know what to do anymore. I messed everything up, Ethan. There was another long pause before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was softer, less guarded. I know you didn't mean to hurt me, Clara. I've been angry, but I've also been thinking about the times when we were good. I don't want to throw that away. The hope in Clara's chest started to bloom, fragile but undeniable. Could this be the first step toward healing? Could they rebuild what they had torn apart? I don't know how we can fix this, Clara admitted, her voice barely a whisper. But I'm willing to try. If you are. Ethan was quiet for a moment, and Clara held her breath, praying that he was still there, still willing to give their relationship a chance. Finally, he spoke again, his voice steady but warm. I'm willing to try, too. But it's going to take time, Clara. We have a lot of work to do. The relief that washed over her was overwhelming. She had never realized how much she had been holding on to the hope that things could get better. Now, there was a chance. A chance to rebuild, to learn from their mistakes and move forward, together. I'll do whatever it takes, Clara said, her voice stronger now, filled with resolve. I'm not giving up on us. They talked for a little longer, discussing what they needed to do, the steps they would take to heal their relationship. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, Clara felt like she wasn't alone in the darkness. Ethan was there, and he was willing to try. And that was enough. The weeks that followed the call with Ethan were a mix of hope, uncertainty, and small, fragile steps forward. Clara had spent so much time in emotional turmoil, but now she was finally facing a future that wasn't filled with regret. They both knew that healing wouldn't be instantaneous, and they weren't going to magically erase the past. But for the first time in a long while, Clara felt like they were moving in the right direction. Ethan and Clara met several times over the following weeks, each conversation more honest than the last. They discussed the pain they had caused each other, and Clara, for the first time, truly understood the depth of Ethan's hurt. She had thought her actions were a momentary lapse, but the consequences had been much greater than she realized. At one point, Ethan admitted that he had felt like she no longer respected him, and that her violent outburst shattered the trust between them. Clara listened, truly listened, and it was hard to hear, but she needed to understand his side. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could work on proving to him that she had learned from it. One afternoon, after a quiet walk in the park, they sat down on a bench, the warmth of the sun on their faces. It was a rare moment of peace, the kind they hadn't shared in months. Ethan turned to Clara, his eyes soft but still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," he began, his voice careful but steady. "About trying to rebuild, and how we're going to do this. I know it won't be easy, but I don't want to lose what we've built together. I think we need to start fresh." Clara nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I want that too, Ethan. I've spent so much time blaming myself, but I know now that we both made mistakes. I can't undo what I did, but I want to prove to you that I'm willing to work for us, to work on myself." Ethan's eyes softened even further, and for a moment, Clara saw the man she had fallen in love with, the man who was willing to try despite everything. He took her hand gently in his. "We're both going to need to change, Clara," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "But if we really want this, we'll have to be patient. We'll have to be honest with each other and ourselves. I want to forgive you, but it's going to take time." Clara understood. She knew that forgiveness didn't happen overnight. She had to earn it, and she was willing to do whatever it took. They would take one step at a time, no matter how small. In the following months, their relationship began to shift. They took things slow, communicating more openly than they ever had before. They attended therapy together, learned how to navigate their conflicts without resorting to anger, and slowly started to trust each other again. Clara worked on controlling her emotions, seeking help when she needed it, and learning how to express herself without resorting to destructive actions. And Ethan, too, worked on his own issues. He realized that he had allowed his frustrations to build without addressing them, and that his silence had created a wedge between them. He learned to speak up, to communicate his feelings before they festered into something larger. One evening, after a particularly meaningful conversation, they sat together on the couch in their apartment, the place that still felt unfamiliar but was starting to feel like home again. Clara rested her head on Ethan's shoulder, a sense of peace settling over her. The road ahead wasn't easy, but they were walking it together, and that was enough. "I'm proud of us," Clara whispered, her voice full of quiet conviction. Ethan kissed the top of her head and smiled softly. "Me too. I think we're going to be okay." And for the first time in a long while, Clara believed him. She believed in them. They had weathered the storm, and though the scars remained, they were learning how to heal them together.